Warsaw, Poland, 1942. A German checkpoint at the entrance to the Warsaw Ghetto. A Polish woman in a nurse's uniform approaches the guards. She is carrying a toolbox. The guards check her papers. They wave her through. Inside the toolbox, a Jewish infant is hidden, sedated just enough to stay silent, wrapped in cloth, breathing very quietly in the darkness. This was not the first time. It would not be the last. Irena Sendler made this crossing so many times that she lost count. She hid children in toolboxes, in coffins, in potato sacks, under floorboards, in ambulances, inside suitcases with air holes punched through the sides. She trained a dog to bark every time German guards approached so that any child hidden in her vehicle would hear the signal and stay absolutely silent. She smuggled 2,500 Jewish children out of the Warsaw Ghetto. 2,500. When the Gestapo finally caught her in 1943, they broke both her legs and both her arms trying to get her to give up the names of her network. She never gave them a single name. This is the story of Irena Sendler, and it is one of the most extraordinary stories of World War II. To understand how a Polish social worker smuggled 2,500 children out of the most heavily guarded ghetto in occupied Europe, you first have to understand who Irena Sendler was. Irena Sendler was born on February 15, 1910 in Warsaw, Poland. Her father was a doctor who treated poor Jewish patients when other doctors refused. He died of typhus contracted from a Jewish patient when Irena was just 7 years old. Before he died, he told her something she carried for the rest of her life. He said, "If you see someone drowning, you must jump in to save them even if you cannot swim." Irena never forgot those words. She grew up with deep connections to the Jewish community in Warsaw. She studied at the University of Warsaw. She became a social worker dedicated to helping the city's most vulnerable people. When Germany invaded Poland in 1939 and the Nazi occupation began, Irena Sendler did not ask what she should do. She already knew. The Warsaw Ghetto was established in November 1940. Over 400,000 Jewish people were forced into an area of less than 1.3 square miles. Conditions were catastrophic: disease, starvation, overcrowding on a scale that defied description. The Nazis calculated that the ghetto would destroy its inhabitants through deprivation alone. They did not need to spend bullets when starvation and typhus would do the work for them. Irena Sendler obtained a permit to enter the ghetto officially. She used her position as a social worker with the Warsaw Social Welfare Department to justify regular access. Her official reason for entering was to inspect sanitary conditions and distribute food and medicine. Her real reason was to find children she could save. Every time she entered the ghetto, she wore a Star of David armband in solidarity with the people inside. She wanted them to know she was not there as an outsider looking in. She was there as someone willing to risk everything to help. She began by asking parents the most impossible question any parent could ever be asked. "Will you give me your child?" The methods Irena Sendler used to smuggle children out of the Warsaw Ghetto were as creative as they were dangerous. Infants were sedated with mild medication and hidden in toolboxes, potato sacks, and beneath loads of goods in carts and vehicles. Larger children were hidden in coffins, in suitcases with air holes, under floorboards of ambulances, and inside packages. She trained a dog, a large dog that sat in the back of her vehicle, to bark loudly every time a German guard approached. The barking covered any sounds a hidden child might make. The guards, annoyed by the dog, would wave the vehicle through more quickly than they otherwise might. Once outside the ghetto, the children needed new identities, false documents, new names, new histories. Irena and her network created hundreds of false papers. They found Polish Catholic families willing to take in Jewish children. They placed children in convents, orphanages, and private homes across Warsaw and beyond. And then Irena did something that nobody told her to do, something that speaks to the kind of person she was more than anything else in this story. She wrote down every child's real name, their Jewish name, their family, where they came from. And she buried the list in jars under an apple tree in her garden, so that after the war the children could find their families, so that nobody would be lost forever. To fully understand what Irena Sendler achieved, you need to sit with the numbers for a moment. 2,500 children. She did not do this alone. She had a network, brave men and women who risked their lives alongside her. Families who opened their homes. Priests who provided false baptismal certificates. Nurses who helped sedate infants for transport. But Irena was the center of everything, the organizer, the one who made the crossings, the one who kept the records, the one who knew where every child was. She made hundreds of crossings in and out of the Warsaw Ghetto, each one potentially her last, each one requiring the same composure, The same steady hands. The same ability to look a German guard in the eye and show nothing of what was hidden in the vehicle, or the bag, or the toolbox she was carrying. She was a quiet Polish social worker. She was the most dangerous resistance fighter in Warsaw, and nobody on the German side suspected her until they did. On October 20th, 1943, the Gestapo came for Irena Sendler. Someone had talked exactly who has never been established. But the Germans knew enough to go to her apartment at dawn with a list of questions she could not answer truthfully. They searched her apartment. They found some of the evidence of her network. Not the jars, not the names. She had been too careful for that. They took her to Powiek prison. What happened to Irena Sendler at Powiek prison over the following weeks is difficult to describe. The Gestapo broke both her legs. They broke both her arms. They used every method of interrogation available to them to try to get her to give up the names of her network. The families hiding children, the priests, the nurses, the other resistance workers. She gave them nothing. Not one name, not one address, not one piece of information that could have led them to a single child or a single member of her network. She endured what was done to her, and she stayed silent. And under an apple tree in her garden, the jars remained buried. The names remained safe. 2,500 children remained hidden. The Gestapo sentenced Irena Sendler to death. She was to be executed. But Irena Sendler's network had not been idle while she was in Powiek prison. The organization she worked with, Zagota, the Polish Council to Aid Jews, had been working frantically to save her. They managed to bribe a Gestapo officer. On the day of her scheduled execution, Irena Sendler was taken from Powiek prison. She was driven to the outskirts of Warsaw, and she was released. The official German records recorded her as executed. She was listed as dead, which meant she could move through Warsaw as a ghost, a dead woman, someone the Germans were no longer looking for. She immediately went back to work, with broken legs that had not properly healed, with broken arms that caused her pain for the rest of her life. She went back to helping children. The Warsaw Ghetto uprising began in April 1943 before Irena's arrest. The remaining Jewish residents of the ghetto rose up against the Germans in one of the most extraordinary acts of resistance in World War II. They had no real hope of winning. They knew that. They fought because the alternative was the death camps without a fight. The Germans suppressed the uprising by May 1943. The ghetto was systematically burned and demolished. By the time the Nazis were finished, the Warsaw Ghetto no longer existed. Most of the people left inside when the uprising ended were sent to Treblinka. The 2,500 children Irena had smuggled out before all of this were already safe. When the war finally ended in 1945, Irena Sendler went to her garden. She dug up the jars from beneath the apple tree. She unfolded the papers inside, and she began the heartbreaking work of trying to reunite 2,500 children with their families. Most of the parents were dead, killed in the ghetto, killed in the uprising, killed in the death camps. The children Irena had saved were orphans now, but they were alive. For decades after World War II, Irena Sendler lived quietly in Warsaw. Communist Poland was not interested in celebrating the stories of people who had worked with organizations like Zagota. The political atmosphere made her story dangerous to tell. She was largely forgotten. In 1965, Yad Vashem recognized her as righteous among the nations. But even that recognition did not bring her story to the world's attention. It was not until 1999 that everything changed. 4 American high school students in Kansas were doing a research project on the Holocaust. They came across a brief mention of Irena Sendler, a line that said she had saved 2,500 children from the Warsaw Ghetto. They thought it must be a misprint. Surely someone who had done something like that would be famous. They began to investigate. What they found astonished them. Irena Sendler was still alive. She was 89 years old, living in a small apartment in Warsaw. The students wrote a play about her called Life in a Jar. It toured across America, and suddenly the world finally knew who Irena Sendler was. In her final years, Irena Sendler received the recognition that should have come decades earlier. In 2003, she received Poland's highest civilian honor. In 2007, the Polish parliament nominated her for the Nobel Peace Prize. She did not win. The Nobel Peace Prize that year went to Al Gore for his work on climate change. When people expressed outrage on her behalf, Irena Sendler said something completely in character. She said, "The prize is not important. What is important is that the world knows what happened, and that it never happens again." She was asked once how she wanted to be remembered. She said, "I want to be remembered as someone who did what any decent person would have done." She was 98 years old when she said that. Irena Sendler died on May 12, 2008. She was 98 years old. At her funeral, the surviving children she had saved, now elderly men and women themselves, came to say goodbye to the woman who had carried them out of the Warsaw Ghetto in toolboxes and coffins and potato sacks. Here is the power play and twisted truth at the heart of Irena Sendler's story. The Nazi system was built on bureaucracy, on paperwork, on official stamps and permits and identity documents, on the belief that their administrative machinery was too thorough to be defeated by individuals. Irena Sendler used all of it against them. She used official permits to enter the ghetto. She used her social worker credentials as cover. She used false documents to give children new identities. She used the corruption of individual German officers against the system those officers served, and then she buried a list, not because she was ordered to, not because it was part of any official resistance plan, because she was a social worker who understood that identity matters, that a child without a name is a child without a history, that the Nazis were not just killing bodies. They were trying to erase people entirely. The jars under the apple tree were her answer to that erasure. You can take their lives, but you cannot take their names. I will keep them. Irena Sendler was not a soldier. She was not a politician, or a general, or a person with power in any conventional sense. She was a social worker whose father told her when she was a small child that if you see someone drowning, you must jump in to save them even if you cannot swim. She spent World War II jumping in 2,500 times. History's Wildside is about power plays and twisted truths, and here is the final twisted truth of Irena Sendler's story. The most dangerous resistance fighter in Warsaw during World War II was a quiet woman with a toolbox and a dog. The Germans broke both her legs and both her arms. They could not break her silence. And under an apple tree in a Warsaw garden, 2,500 names waited in jars for the war to end. Those names are the children, and the children are alive, and their children are alive, and their children's children are alive. Because one woman jumped in, even though she knew she might not be able to swim. Subscribe to History's Wildside for a new story every Sunday. Power plays, twisted truths, and the moments that changed everything. This has been History's Wildside. I will see you next Sunday.